So we'll wait for Rebecca to join, but let's go ahead and formally get started. Welcome. My name is Peter Nestor. I work as a manager at BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, based here in San Francisco. I think I might be the only person at the conference using actual paper notes. It's a little bit of a Luddite in that respect, but feel free to take out your laptops and type away as well. So welcome to this fireside chat. That is the format for today's talk. It is called Human Rights Obligations of Home States and Parent Companies. Although I think you'll find that the conversation will probably be a lot more involved than that. And quite frankly, we're happy to take it really in whatever direction the group would like to go. This is intended to be a very informal format, and so hoping to get some good questions and discussion from those in the room. Please feel free to jump in, interrupt with any thoughts or questions as the conversation gets flowing, and just imagine that there is a real fire right here, and we're all sort of sitting around it, having. Oh, there's some fire. Oh, there's some fire section. Good. Great. So I think the goal today really will be to look at how companies who have committed to respecting human rights operate in countries that are challenging environments from a human rights perspective, and specifically around what the engagement looks like there. So engagement with the host country and engagement back with the home country as well. And I think just for our panelists, and we'll let Rebecca know this as well when she arrives, but the focus, I think, of today's talk is really to try to keep it on practical, a practical discussion.
I like it.
Hi, Rebecca.
Sorry. Hi. You too.
Are you, yeah.
Sorry.
I just finished another session.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Okay.
Just kind of opening it.
Okay.
Yeah, so what are you
Run away. Oh, my schedule got messed up, and somehow I thought it was at a later time.
Oh.
Anyway,
Okay.
it's my fault.
Well, it's pretty informal, so hopefully we can just jump right in. We're just getting underway, so welcome. So just saying that I hope the focus for today's talk can be very practical focused in terms of what companies are actually doing, what countries are actually doing, or could be doing. And so we have about an hour together, and looking to jump. Before we get started, I wanted to just see sort of who is in the room joining us today. So just by a show of hands only, who is here from representing companies or businesses, if any? A couple. And civil society or NGO community? Okay. Any academics in the room? A couple. And then any representatives from governments? All right. Well, we'll be sure and let them know what we think as we talk about exactly what they should be doing. Oh.
He just asked if there are any representatives from government.
Oh yeah, right on time. Not playing.
Yes, we move the stakeholder. Let's move to.
Yeah.
We just move.
Sure.
Get it.
And good. And let me go ahead and introduce who's up on stage. Although I don't think it'll take much of an introduction. Probably just their first names are enough. I guess starting in the middle, Michael Posner is a professor of business and society at NYU's Stern School of Business, where he is currently launching the first Center on Business and Human Rights at a business school. Prior to joining NYU, Mike served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. And from 1978 to 2009, he led Human Rights First, New York-based human rights advocacy organization. Rebecca McKinnon, who is
a genuinely confused person.
Oh.
Anyway.
Sorry. Yeah. So is genuinely confused, I suppose, but also a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation, works with the University of Pennsylvania and Internews on the Ranking Digital Rights Project, and the author of Consent of the Network, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom, published in 2012. Rebecca also spent a considerable amount of time in Asia, working as the CNN bureau chief in Beijing and Tokyo from 1998 to 2003. Patrick Hyselius is joining us as the Senior Advisor on Digital Rights at TeliaSonera. TeliaSonera is a Swedish-based telecoms company with operations throughout Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, and Spain. Patrick has been working on freedom of expression and privacy issues for over 20 years and has been instrumental in helping to establish multi-stakeholder initiatives, including the Global Network Initiative and Industry Dialogue. So very happy to have all of our panelists here. So let's jump right in. Obviously, under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, businesses have an obligation to respect human rights. States have an obligation to protect human rights, to support businesses in doing so. That can become very gray when companies are operating in higher risk environments. So I wondered if I could just sort of turn to the group and kind of level set a little bit for everyone in the room, maybe frame some of the issues. What are the types of challenges that we're seeing, say, have we seen, and can we expect to see over the next couple of years in these types of environments, where businesses are operating in high-risk kind of environments from a human rights perspective? So from technology companies.
Yeah, should I start off?
Sure.
As said, TeliaSonera, we have our home operations in Nordic and Baltics, but we also have operations in countries in Eurasia. And I see three main challenges when operating there. One is about the laws, and as when we here at RightsCon and people that we meet daily can know the difference between quote, contribute and link, in the public debate that's often mixed up. So we operate under very restrictive draconian laws. We are accused of causing human rights violations rather than being linked to. So that's something which is a challenge for us in addressing these issues when we are to respect human rights also in these operations. Another challenge with these laws are that they most often contain provisions on confidentiality, so that when we want to be transparent on major events, that is networks closed down, etc., the laws prohibit us to do so. That's a big challenge, and it's sometimes often very frustrating. So that's the laws. Another big challenge is what I would call heritage, where we as a company have not built the operations in these countries from the start, but we have rather acquired existing operations with their licenses, with their modus operandi, etc. So a challenge is that most often we don't have a 100% ownership of these companies. We might have 80% or 60%, or in some cases 49% or 20%. And there is a governance issue, how to implement our values, which are formulated in our group policies into these and I can talk maybe a little bit more about that.
Sure.
A third challenge I want to mention is that whereas the point of challenge and the discussion is ongoing on an international level, and we build understanding and define ways forward, that is not very much happening yet on the local ground. I said that in the panel I was in yesterday. We need to find next steps to have the dialogue and the point of challenge happening also on the ground in these countries. So those were three challenges I see.
Okay. And even maybe just to be a little bit more specific about what's happening. So a lot of this is coming from, say, requests from governments for information, for data about users, or coming in the form of surveillance activities, or in the form of network shutdown type activities.
Yeah, so in many of these countries you have both what we know as day-to-day normal lawful intercept to prosecute drug dealings or whatever crimes there are. And there are requests from prosecutors, as we know it in our own countries. And besides that, in parallel, in many countries there is a system which is called SORM, which is a system for unrestricted direct access, where government has access to our systems and our networks in a way that we are completely without control of. And this, of course, is a huge problem from a human rights perspective.
Anything to add in terms of what we might be seeing in the future on some of these issues, or does that kind of capture where the challenges really lie?
I mean, there are multiple challenges, but one other that we worked a lot on when I was in the State Department with John and others, really had to do with the risks to users in tough environments, and I think especially with mobile phones, there just is a huge. People don't know the risks they're under. They don't understand the extent to which governments, the U.S. government, but certainly lots of pernicious governments, are afraid of advocacy. They're afraid. Insecure governments behave badly when they're confronted by people who are organizing to challenge them. And I think we looked at 70 or 80 countries in the last 5 or 6 years that have passed new laws, regulations, both limiting freedom of association, free speech, free press, going after bloggers. But there's also the more pernicious side, which is really, getting inside people's computers, getting inside their phones. Nothing is secure, and I think a lot of the activists don't know or appreciate how vulnerable they are, and so they take risks. And so I think that's a big subject, and both for the advocacy community, for the philanthropic community, for governments, to really try to understand that and get behind it is very hard.
Just to, again, kind of broaden the bigger picture here, kind of the issue of responsibilities and what companies can do. I mean, the issue is that there's no country on earth where governments aren't making demands that arguably violate user rights in some way. And when you're talking about sort of the home, the company that's going out and doing business elsewhere in regimes, in markets where the regimes are considered particularly repressive, what do you do? And I along with Mike and Patrick was there too. We were involved with setting up the Global Network Initiative that in many ways is meant to give companies guidance on dealing with these issues. And the fundamental problem is that law ranges from bad to complete crap, right? Kind of around the world, right? It's on that kind of scale going down. And there's not a lot of places where the law is really great, and in most places, even in democracies, law is getting worse in a lot of cases around speech online, around intermediary liability, around so Turkey's a really great example. And so what is a company to do? Because if a company is going to say, I'm not going to do business anywhere where the law is bad, they will do business absolutely zero, nowhere, right? So it's a bad world out there with a lot of bad law. And so what are the principles to think about? Now, in an ideal world, we would have had our principles, we would have had GNI, we would have had rugged principles around long before telecommunications and internet companies started spreading out in the world, so that we would have started from a point of due diligence before anybody started doing business. But that didn't happen, right? And so with GNI, and let's take the case of Yahoo, which was one of the seminal cases of doing business in a difficult environment where a company got in trouble, right? Yahoo got in trouble because they went into China, set up an email service, and didn't think through the consequences. They didn't do their due diligence about what it was going to mean to have an email service in a regime where if you're running an email service, you're going to be handing over dissident information to the government. That's just a given. And they hadn't thought through what those implications were going to be and how they were going to handle it or anything. And then the Shurtao case happened where the Chinese journalist Shurtao got jailed and on evidence provided by Yahoo, and there was information leaked that proved this, and and that was one of the cases that led to the formation of GNI. But the principles that the GNI developed and the operational guidelines were that thou shalt commit civil disobedience in every market that you're doing business in. That's not the principle, right? The principle is you will do your due diligence before you go in and make decisions about what you are and are not going to offer based on the context, the legal situation, and do everything you can if you decide to go in to mitigate risks. And in an ideal world, you have done this before you've gone in, right? And then you're also going to be transparent about what it is that you're having to comply with, and making sure your users are well informed. So if you're operating in a place that has a direct line, has a black box on your in your facilities in that country, that users have an opportunity to kind of be aware of the type of surveillance that you are operating under, so that they can then make informed choices about how to use the service. So it's kind of an issue of transparency. But it's hard because you really wish that these principles had been set up before we got so far, because now everybody's having to backtrack. Now everybody's having to say, well, we're already in all these places, and in some cases some due diligence was done, but in a lot of cases not so much. And governments have already gotten very accustomed to making all kinds of demands and having full compliance from multinational companies as well as from domestic ones. And now how do we sort of walk it back and that's a real challenge. It's really difficult, and I certainly feel for Patrick for being in that position.
One thing where we should do more, I agree, is to be transparent of what these laws really mean. At the same time, I think many users do know that there is far more surveillance, and what happens is sometimes they don't use their phones, which is bad for our business. So this is why sustainability and respecting human rights is a business case for us. One way of addressing the ongoing situation, because there is of course new requests and changes of the operation of the surveillance, etc., is that we implement a very strict escalation procedure within the company. So as where a couple of years ago, if there was much too far going demand from the machine, the decision would be taken locally. Today we have a very strong policy on group level with a very strong statement from the CEO. So when there is a too far going demand locally, the local people can point at, this is what another company wants, this is the statement from the CEO, and I am told to escalate. And the escalation procedure draws away the decision from the local context, where the local person might be, for various reasons, have difficulties to pursue the point of challenge, which is easier further up in the organization, and less difficult.
Can I just follow up with one thing real quick? Yeah. This is really following on what Rebecca talked about. You mentioned the guiding principles and what are the various responsibilities. I think we're at a point now in this industry and frankly many other industries where we have to go beyond every company on a journey and corporate social responsibility. We've got to talk about what Rebecca talked about, basically standards for each industry, real standards, concrete standards. What's the core business? How does the company make a profit? And in that area, what are the human rights challenges? And what's the industry across the board going to do? Industry has to be involved in that discussion and setting the standards. They're not going to be imposed from outside. But then, what are the metrics? What are the ways to implement? What are the ways to evaluate? And how do you basically then create some notion of consumer investor pressure? One company looking at another, and the industry and the people outside looking at it and saying, who's doing a better job? That's, I think, the theory of the GNI. It's the theory of some other multi-stakeholder initiatives. There are different ways to go about it. There isn't one size fits all. But I think too many companies have been in the position of saying, well, we're doing our best. We have a nice process. We have a statement from somebody inside that says, we really care. No. We have to start looking at real standards and metrics, and that's also what Rebecca's been doing in this space, trying to really begin to figure out how do you evaluate companies. Again, companies need to be part of the discussion, but it can't just be due diligence. At the end of the day, Professor Ruggie said we're at the end of the beginning of the discussion. Let's get on to the middle of the discussion and create some real standards.
Yeah, and an interesting point in terms of the evaluation, because that would ideally happen publicly. It would ideally be very transparent. And yet one of the tensions, particularly in this aspect of companies doing business in these countries, is that it seems over the past few years there have been more examples of effective engagement that often occurs behind the scenes, or that there is a transparency tension there, right, between how much companies can disclose publicly about what they're doing, potentially restricted by the government or potentially for other reasons, and yet a demand from civil society or other stakeholders or other public groups that would like to see some insight into what's going on here. What's the scope of responsibility look like?
Yeah, well, there's some parallels in that debate, parallels about WikiLeaks. Like, can you put? I mean, I'm sort of drawing a high, kind of extreme parallel, but the argument that everything has to be out there in public, or in order to achieve human rights, do there actually need to be some confidential processes and secrets going on? And if you get, what's the right level of transparency to be accountable? Whereas, is radical transparency really going to achieve human rights, or is it going to achieve something else? And I think this is one of the, bringing it back, from my radical analogy to reality here. I think this is one of the dilemmas we face, with my rankings project, I think with GNI, with a lot of human rights related processes, at least in the ICT sector, on free expression and privacy, and I imagine on other issues too, where there are some things that if you shed light on them, you will kill them. There are some things that companies are doing that actually, if you expose too much information about what they're doing to protect their most vulnerable users, then that's going to actually result in governments finding ways to destroy that effort. And so, I've found, or also just in terms of how companies engage with stakeholders, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, if it were made too public, couldn't happen. And so achieving the right balance in terms of being transparent where transparency really promotes accountability. Or also, like, I've been having a lot of discussions with companies about how much detail they can disclose about their human rights impact assessments, which, or their human rights due diligence and risk assessment processes internally. And there's a fine balance there, because they're really kind of asking themselves the hard questions. And if they put that all out there in public, is that actually, so you want to have some level of, informing the public about what you're doing. But on the other hand, in order to actually do an operation, in order to have an honest internal conversation, you can't have that entire conversation in public, or it won't happen. And so just as with government, if you're going to do, not everything can be on a wiki. Similarly, companies in their efforts to achieve respect for user rights have to achieve the right balance. And I think this is where we as civil society and other stakeholders can really help companies, try and work constructively on where you get that balance right.
Yeah.
And to kind of push to the extent possible, but also recognize that radical transparency is probably not the answer, or in my opinion, it's not.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from some of the civil society focused people. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, this is from civil society, not from business, but I'm kind of sympathizing a little bit with how difficult the problem is for businesses, and I see some parallels with the arms control sort of debates and everything, and in that if you're a civic-minded or socially responsible company, you know that if you don't, say for example, sell to Iran, then your competitor is going to. And it seems like these standards, codes of conduct, whatever, unless they're universal, or at the very least laws of one country, then it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for a company that is, after all, seeking profit to just restrain themselves voluntarily from a market. I mean, how does that work exactly?
It's
And I'm
hard,
asking
but it's not impossible.
And if you could just give your
Yeah.
name and organization.
Miriam Amarsadeghi, we work on Iran, e-learning for human rights for Iran. How exactly do we expect these companies to restrain themselves if there's no law, or at the very, you mean?
Well,
Well,
go ahead.
just on Iran in particular, one of the things, part of this discussion is also home country regulation, and there was a regulation, an executive order out of the Obama administration relating to transfer of technology to Iran and Syria. Now, we can debate how well it was enforced. That's a discussion unto itself. But I think there are a number of ways now, especially on the reporting side, where government is beginning, the U.S. government at least, is beginning, for example, on Burma and lifting the Jade Act. There are now reporting requirements for every company doing $500,000 worth of business, who they're dealing with, what the human rights implications are, Dodd-Frank on extractive industries, Congo. But I think there's probably some ways in which, in some ways, governments, home governments, can at least create some greater, public awareness of what's going on. What I call the dark side of it.
Because like after 2009, just really quickly, after 2009 Green Movement, we all said, oh, it's so terrible, Nokia Siemens sold this mobile surveillance technology to the Iranian regime. To this day, at least I don't know how we would have done that differently. What exactly could anyone have done to prevent something like that?
Well, that's what these regulations were meant to do.
Yeah.
Two things. I mean, due respect, but the question is somehow wrongly put.
Okay.
So what I need to do within my company and my colleagues within other telecoms is to explain the business case to respect human rights. If there is no business case, if I don't make it visible that this is what investors want, this is what customers want, this is what our employees want, this is what the international community wants, then it won't happen in my company. So it's a business case for our business to respect human rights. And the other way of doing it is, of course, going together, because you have much less leverage. If Nokia NSN is part of our industry dialogue, 9 companies today, it would have been easier for them in the context of shared learning within the industry dialogue, and also in the work between the industry dialogue and GNI, to know what to do at the time of when the equipment was sold.
It was or it was not?
The industry dialogue and the GNI, the industry dialogue at least didn't exist at the time. I don't know if the GNI. So one way of addressing the difficulty is to join forces to have better leverage.
But to push back, there are going to be companies that are going to say, we have a business case to make to our board that is about selling to Syria and Iran, and we can make money. And by the way, Nokia Siemens just made the socially responsible decision. They're not going to do it, so the market just opened up to us.
Exactly. So that's why it's so important that additional players join GNI and or industry dialogue.
Do you have any NGOs here, any civil society from South Africa? Because one of the companies that I would pay attention to is MTN on this one.
Positive
In
or
what
negative?
sense?
Well, that they, you know, this is publicly reported, they're involved. And there's very little attention in South Africa to their involvement.
And maybe coming back just to this, the initial discussion on the finding the balance between being transparent and being effective in some cases. Do we have any? Are we starting to see companies that are setting good examples that other companies can follow? Or Patrick, when you're trying to work through some of these decisions internally, are you looking to guidance from other companies that have gotten it right?
As to transparency?
Yeah, as to how do you be on the transparency issue? Yeah.
So the issue of transparency is what we have is there is quite a pressure in the US and somewhat also in the UK on the telcos to be transparent. There's much less pressure elsewhere in the world. For example, my company, we published a total figure in how many requests that we received in Finland, and it hasn't been noticed whatsoever. So we have had no questions and no debate. So the debate is very vivid here and somewhat in the UK, but not elsewhere. As to transparency, I come back to my customers, my company's customers in Eurasia and elsewhere, and I see that it's more so the what we call the major events, and specifically so unrestricted real-time access, which is the main problem for the main violation of freedom of expression. So that's where we should shed more light and work more, because there no one has control how much the government access. And of course there is also networks shutdowns, etc. One thing I want to highlight is that our customers in these countries are predominantly prepaid voice and SMS. It's not internet. Okay, data will come in due time, but today it's more voice and SMS, etc. And in the debates like these days here at RightsCon, I sometimes feel that the discussions are too focused on the internet, whereas when my customers' SMS networks shut down, that is as much a violation of human rights. And we need to acknowledge that and take that into account in our discussions as well. And when we try to be transparent on these major events, and I'm coming to my point, there are these provisions on confidentiality we're not allowed to tell. Sometimes we were, in one occasion many years ago, we were even told to tell a lie why the network was down. That of course we refused, but we have not been able to. We don't break the law and tell. What we have done is that we have published on our homepage a short note saying that during the last 9 months in this region, Eurasia, there were approximately 20 requests for network shutdown or blockings. But if we go further than that, we will break the law. We would want to go further, but we can't.
Mike or Rebecca, any sort of other examples or companies that you're thinking of that have started to get this balance right, or where sort of the stakeholder community has been understanding of the company position?
Well, we both worked with the, Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, 6-7 years ago in setting up the GNI, and they took a risk. They came in a room with NGOs, with, social investment funds and the like, and they said, let's negotiate standards. And then they put themselves through the paces. And they've now, Sarah Altshuler talked about it yesterday, but they've now begun to evaluate. Rebecca's building on it by doing these metrics. I think, again, the telcos haven't stepped up. Where's Twitter? Where are there a whole bunch of other companies that aren't at the table? So I think it's to the credit of those that were the first there and put themselves at risk by being out there. I think it can be done. It's not only the telcos, it's also where's Cisco? There's a slew of companies that are involved in this space that ought to be essentially, judged by similar criteria. Again, they should help define the territory. but then let's have a real discussion. Metrics, let's have a real, you do it in the financial world. No company thinks twice about financial reporting. Everybody holds the same standard. The public expects it. If you want to talk about the business case comes when consumers can evaluate one company against another by the same standard. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a work in progress, right, in terms of what is the ideal level of transparency. And I think there are some companies that are further along, but I think we're all kind of collectively negotiating where that spot should be. And there was a session on Monday about transparency reporting and standards around that, and even just in terms of transparency reporting as it's known as a genre. It's mainly about reporting the number of requests you receive. More companies are reporting on the number of data requests than they're reporting on takedown or shutdown or blocking requests. And so, how do you get companies to be equally good about all the different types of requests, but also being transparent, to kind of reporting sort of basic information to the public about your processes for handling government requests, your processes for how you're enforcing your terms of service. There's a lot of different, and we've got a whole project we're kind of working through standards really around transparency, and kind of debating how high we should hold the standard above what people feel that they can currently do, and how hard to push. But again, the goal is not radical transparency on everything. The goal is the right amount of transparency so that people understand how power is being exercised. Either if it's government power via the companies upon the users, or if it's the company exercising its power to shape its own service or to carry out its commercial business. And people need to have sufficient understanding about how power is being exercised over their digital lives and their digital activities and their access to information, so that if they feel that power is being abused, they can hold it accountable. And that's governance. I mean, that's for those who are into talking to governments about that, it's the same thing. And in this digital age with the new technologies, we're still working out exactly where the sweet spot is. And not just for companies, for governments, because the flip side is that unless we get governments to be more transparent about what they're demanding, unless we get governments to allow companies to report, and we need a broader movement to get governments to reverse some of these awful laws they're passing that are forcing, so there's a much broader ecosystem that obviously needs to take place.
Good. Let me put one more big topic on the table and then kind of open it up for questions. We've got a number of kind of lines of inquiry open here, but wanted to look at companies increasing leverage in their negotiations or discussions, engagement with states. Good session earlier this morning on this. Obviously, we've heard today a lot about collaboration, working with industry coalitions, trying to bring companies together as a more effective way to gain leverage over states. We've heard about some creative legal mechanisms, potentially using contract law or contract provisions to gain leverage over states. What are we starting to see as some of the more effective ways or more creative ways to think about doing that?
One of the things that was very striking to me when I was in government was how often a single company would come and say, "Ooh, we have a real problem in country X. Would you help us out?" And I'd say, I've heard from 3 other companies. Have you talked to them? No, we haven't exactly talked to them. It's not possible everywhere. There are places, China would be one that's so big and commercially important that it's hard to get everybody to weigh in. But there are places where I think collective pressure by companies together. The notion that governments say you can't talk about what you're doing. I mean, if every company comes in the same way and says, no, we're not going to tolerate that, there's some places where I think the combination of diplomatic pressure from governments and a united industry position would be enormously helpful.
Yeah, and to add to that too, finding allies in civil society and in politics, because China is an example where you can't do that so much because allies in civil society just go to jail when you reach out to them. But there are many societies, Turkey would be an example, or the Philippines, or many other places where these battles are being fought that It's where you get that alliance between a part of industry and certain actors in civil society who share common goals, and identifying who in the political, who in parliament actually wants to take up this issue. So in the Philippines, there's a couple of politicians who've really taken up kind of fighting against bad internet laws as kind of their signature thing. And finding the right allies, because when you do see progress, it tends to be that you get this convergence between industry, civil society, and different bits of government from different places kind of converging. You almost never get change if it's just one category of actor alone.
There's a very good example where the CEO of one of our local companies, Viocel in Georgia, has initiated this type of discussion, and together with an NGO, in this case Transparency International, which in Georgia works much broader than only anti-corruption. And as you said, with parts of the government, the process is not finalized yet, but it is about changing the law to more democratic oversight and less draconian surveillance laws. So we hope to push that through, and very much with the help of the collaboration between the NGO, the company, and some politicians.
Great. Well, we'd love to certainly hear from more in the room, and if you could just state your name and the organization you're with.
Gerald Gray with Accountability Council. Here in San Francisco, there is a third way in case governments or businesses are not self-regulating, or we can't wait on politicians to be drawn in, or the rule of law takes too long or doesn't function. We take complaints from communities whose position on environment or human rights is that their human rights and environmental life is being violated by a company overseas, a company from this country, for instance. We've taken 17 cases so far. What we do is go to the funding agencies, if they are international, the IMF, the World Bank, and elsewhere. And we present evidence to those funding agencies because they have rules for behavior when they make a loan. They have rules for behavior for the company that receives that money. The communities generally don't know that there are such rules, and the funding agency doesn't know that the rules are being violated. We see that the community is informed, that they know how to gather evidence. We present the evidence to the funding agencies, and the funding agencies threaten to not fund further. This means, and we've been successful in 17 cases so far in having the companies adhere to the rules. We're prepared to go to court if necessary. We haven't done that because it hasn't been necessary so far. There are other ways to think about how to approach this, which can overcome some of the frustration of civil society. Otherwise, we're relying on government and businesses to behave themselves, and we know what that means.
Thank you. Yeah. So, what are some
God love San Francisco.
these quasi-judicial institutions? Yeah.
Well, this is, working with funding agencies, this is sort of another side of the strategy of working with investors. The financial leverage and socially responsible investment community, and making sure that they have the data, the metrics, the information they need to include freedom of expression and privacy in their investment decisions, along with their, environmental screens and labor screens and the other screens that they use. And so absolutely kind of going to the money and making sure that the money is well informed about the impact it is having on the people they fund. is really key.
I think my point is, it's innovative, it hasn't been thought of or done, and we have to go outside the traditional ways.
Yeah.
Good. Interesting for you to write that up. Actually, I'd love to see something about
Okay.
If you go to the Accountability Council website,
Okay.
it's written up there
Great.
extensively about all the cases they've
Okay.
been involved in, which are fantastic.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in the technology sector. I think a lot of the cases so far are mostly in extractives or
Resource extractive industry, locations in Asia and South America, all over the place.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. My name is John Ty. I work at the U.S. State Department. This is a slightly different tack from some of the things we've been talking about. Some people think that the U.S. Supreme Court is taking an inconsistent line with regard to corporate law on certain issues, where on the one hand, corporations are given all of these First Amendment rights to, which is interpreted as donate, you're allowed to donate as much money as you want to political action committees. On the other hand, with some of the alien tort statute cases and things, they're saying, well, they don't have to meet responsibilities on the other end. What's your perspective on this line of Supreme Court cases and sort of what that means for business and human rights?
There's a recent action brought by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in one of the Dodd-Frank cases. And essentially they took the position that their free speech rights were being violated by being required to report on the supply chain in the Congo for extractors. You put that case next to Citizens United and you go, what? The fact is, though, that, I don't know how it is in Europe, but it's certainly true here that there's been a huge backlash on the corporate side against using the courts to deal with extraterritorial events. Kibel obviously is a big setback in that regard. So I think it's going to take a lot of work, and there's some other cases sort of percolating up, but I think the disposition of this Supreme Court certainly is not very hospitable to the notion that they're going to be the regulator of this space. It means there's got to be more pressure, alternative pressure. Again, some of it reporting, which I think the government probably can do without being challenged, although they are being challenged in Dodd-Frank. And I think it means that some of the things we're talking about in terms of industry regulating itself or these multi-stakeholder initiatives, more reporting is going to probably play a bigger role, at least in the short term. I don't want to be a downer, but that's sort of where the courts are right now.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that. Access engaged with MTN, a South African telco, only generally after Turkcell sued MTN in U.S. court using the ATS. We engaged with them publicly and privately. They agreed to produce a human rights policy, which they did not have at that point. After Kibel, a few months later, the case was dismissed and our calls were no longer taken. So I think that shows that, this is a private legal action between two large telcos, but it also definitely helped, an NGO to get access. So I'm glad that Rebecca's project is going to be ranking down.
Yeah, just following on that point, there's actually, while U.S. courts are sort of retreating in terms of international tort liability, other courts are getting better with it. So more expansive interpretation. So Canada, for instance, recently important case it's in the extractive sector, but the principle applies across the board that a case against a parent company for violations committed by the subsidiary, by security forces hired by the subsidiary, that was allowed to proceed against the parent company. And one of the justifications was that you could look to the guiding principles as a standard of care. So you could skip the subsidiary division by applying a direct liability argument to the parent company. That's in preliminary stages, but the principle is actually pretty significant. And now we have a standard of care for certain companies, no matter where they operate. And there's a similar case in England, also in the metals context, Montero Metals, that it had to do with risk management systems and whether the parent company put in place the right risk management system. So there is hope, and in terms of business incentives, the legal risks are multiplying, but they're multiplying not through legislation. They're multiplying because there's consensus around these standards, which then becomes indirectly binding through private law and international law.
Were you referring to Hubei Minerals in
Yeah.
Canada, in Guatemala?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a follow-up on that.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I'm curious, I'm sorry if this has already been asked, but about the UN Guiding Principles becoming ultimately a legal treaty, legally binding document, or with changes to it, of course. And looking at the case of Jeanette Calwas, who was murdered in Honduras several years ago, and her case came before the Inter-American Court, but what happened there is applicable internationally, where the court said that environmental defenders are human rights defenders and those at risk must be protected. And connecting the two mentions that Ruggie made of human rights defenders in the UN Guiding Principles therefore leads us to a requirement, a duty of governments to protect environmental defenders, particularly those confronting governments and resource extractive industry businesses who are in collusion and complicity against these environmental and land defenders, but also using the guiding principles which says human rights defenders must be respected by businesses and protected by governments. So I'm wondering if you all have any comments about that, and I have copies of the article about the Callas case and the subsequent case.
Look, I think the guiding principles played a very useful role in putting this subject on the agenda as a legitimate subject. The guiding principles were a reaction in some ways to the UN norms that were proposed 15 or 20 years ago, which were soundly rejected by every government. The government of Ecuador is trying to reopen that debate. It's not going to succeed. And I think the guiding principles don't take us far enough. The notion that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights, lots of companies come to me and they say, that's nice, what does it mean for us? Even due diligence, it's a nice phrase. We've got to look at each industry's specific problems. How does an industry make its money? What's its core business? What are the human rights challenges? We've got to establish standards that companies themselves have a role in creating, and then do the metrics, the implementation, and evaluation. So I think it's not useful to try to make more. The guiding principles are a point in time, but as Professor Ruggie said, it's the end of the beginning of the discussion. We've got to now move forward with more specificity in terms of standards, implementation, evaluation.
Yeah, whereas a mutual friend of ours likes to say the guiding principles are a floor, not a ceiling.
Yeah.
But it's also important to point out too that there have been a lot of sets of principles that were under development before the guiding principles came out. So the G&I principles were already quite mature before the guiding principles came out. And there are some projects that are saying, oh, well, now we're going to evaluate the G&I principles based on Ruggie, and it's like, no, the G&I, kind of preceded, and also the guiding principles are, we're formulated more in the context of extractives and labor rights, where it's a problem with companies not following the law, rather than the law being the problem to begin with, which is the problem with the ICT sector and for expression of privacy issues. And so, as Mike says, the principles kind of as a broad brush are a nice broad brush, but until you kind of work out what they actually mean operationally and then kind of what the gaps are, there are things in there that just, for specific industries and specific issues don't neatly apply one way or the other, or there's a whole set of things it doesn't really address. So Mike's absolutely right in terms of just needing to flesh things out.
But developing the guiding principles towards a legally binding document.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
That's not what they're intended to be, and you're never going to. Legally binding means that governments are going to endorse that. If they endorse it, what governments are going to want to know is what are we actually compelling companies to do, and companies are going to say each industry is very different. For the telcos, it's very different than extractives. They're very different than somebody manufacturing illusions. You just can't have something that says for everybody the same.
Yeah.
Just want to challenge Michael's point a little bit. You mentioned twice that companies need to be brought on board to setting up these standards, engagement with companies, and I'm just wondering why are we so convinced that they would be bona fide partners? I mean, I think if you look at the motive for why companies exist, public or private, regardless of what industry they're in, oil or technology, they have one goal, make money, and as much money as possible, return on investment, give value to shareholders. And I think if you look at the environmental question, BP, Exxon Valdez, Ecuador, and Chevron, these companies will fight tooth and nail to minimize their obligation, to minimize their responsibility, to minimize liability and exposure. That's why they're happy to spend thousands of dollars to outside law firms helping them defend these cases, because they'd rather do that than actually address the issue. And so I'm wondering, how can we be convinced then that these standards they'll be setting up for privacy online is not just going to be the absolute floor, even though we think it's a ceiling from their perspective? That, we know they want to pay as little as possible. That's just the way it is. How do you reconcile that conflict?
So, well, what I say first of all is I start from the premise that it's not a sin that companies want to make money, but they ought to make money in a way that also respects human rights. And I don't think those things are inconsistent. Does it mean that every company is going to be embracing of this? No. Does it mean it's not going to be a fight over a negotiation over both the language of what the standards are, how they're implemented, et cetera, how they're evaluated, whether some external person comes in to evaluate behavior? No, every one of those things is a fight. But at the end of the day, what's the alternative? Home governments. The United States government, I can tell you, having watched and been in the middle of it, the United States government is not going to regulate laws that make it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally. It's the same thing with the Swedish government and the U.K. government. The courts, we can say there's a case in Canada or there's a case here and there. It's a tip of the iceberg. There has to be, companies have to be brought into the discussion and pushed to both operate on the theory they're profit-making enterprises, but there have to be rules of the road for the way they operate.
And
How
part of
else
it
would
is,
you do it?
yeah, and working with companies to redefine how they define success, right? I mean, because there's short-term success, which is much more, quarterly results driven, and then there's long-term success, which ends up being defined much more about sustainability.
But
Sustainability that relates to communities you're operating in, sustainability related to the environment, sustainability related to the value proposition, and yeah, there's tons of companies that kind of give lip service and are kind of do the minimum. But unless and until we get to a different world where law is actually going to do what we want it to do, you actually have to find a way to work with companies. And yeah, you can have a stick. I mean, that's one reason why I'm doing the ranking, is to kind of have a bit of a stick. But it's not going to work if I just kind of put it out there and don't engage with companies at all on what the what the incentive is to get them to change. And it's unfortunately, you end up having to be pragmatic because governments aren't going to pass the laws you really wish them to pass.
The single thing that the advocacy community could do that would be the most useful would be to get BlackRock and Magellan and Fidelity to, all I want them to do is do no harm. Stop saying the only thing that matters is the next quarter. I don't know how it is in Europe, but I talk to lots of people on the corporate side who say, we would like to be more sustainable, we'd like to pay attention to environment, to human rights, but I'm out of here if I don't meet my quarterly P&L statement.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that
But are you going to address that through regulation, or are you going to address that through kind of?
I'm not sure that it's a binary question. I would go with Gerald's point that maybe there's a third way, and that I think it's a bit naive to think either we talk to Google about privacy, and Google really, or we talk to the U.S. government, really? I think there's a third way.
What's the third way? I don't
the
get
courts
it.
certainly go into
I'm not saying I have the answers, I'm just saying that's a question that needs to be asked.
But isn't the third way this combination of law is never going to be the answer. That you can draft as many laws as you like, and there's always a way around the law.
Absolutely.
But it's got to be a combination of, if you're trying to change something, you've got to engage the stakeholders who are most engaged. And so here it's government and companies and civil society, workers, etc. So if you just leave one out of the equation, you're never going to change corporate culture by law. That can influence over time, but then you find another way to get around it. So how do you change companies if you don't, at some point, also engage them in the discussion? Now, some you may have to discard at some point along the road, but I don't think we can start by the point of saying they're all out of the discussion because of what their motive is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
Slightly different question, picking up on the sort of the standards-based approach and what governments can do to promote a standards-based approach outside of legislation or regulation. And I'm curious, and I'm watching the work that the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable is doing on national action plans. And I say that serving the secretariat role for the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and watching what's happening in Europe with the development of national action plans that explicitly reference, the government is going to promote the voluntary principles. And some of the governments that are saying that in their national action plans have not actually yet joined, but we think they're coming. But we're starting to get calls from new companies that, okay, our governments are taking this seriously. They're referencing this set of standards. Maybe we should be participating in this conversation. And as I watch that develop, I think there is a role for the national action plans on implementing the guiding principles to drive some of, at least to a set of voluntary standards, and engaging with those governments. There is a little bit of a stick because they're saying, we are setting forth our responsibility to protect human rights, and we're signaling companies to engage in adhere to voluntary standards. But if they don't, there is this sense that down the road, if we're still seeing a lot of misbehavior on behalf of companies based on our jurisdiction, we may take further action, whether it's legislation or regulation. So I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I know there's a lot of work to work with other governments around the world to develop these national action plans. And I'm just curious in your thought on the role of that.
Well, I'd be interested. I mean, I've looked at like the UK National Action Plan. I haven't seen very many others. But I'd be interested to see how many UK-based companies have changed their actual behavior because of the National Action Plan. I know, again, I worked on the voluntary principles, trying to get even the European governments to push. I tried to get Nigeria and Libya and Iraq and others in, and we didn't get a lot of help on that. And so at the end of the day, you can have a national action plan that says the guiding principles, but when push comes to shove, I want the Dutch and the UK to be saying this actually matters to us, to good luck Jonathan, and say you better join this or there's some consequence. I didn't have a lot of, everybody wasn't rushing to help.
Yeah.
It's a good segue. I want to come back to just to the home state duty, which we haven't really talked a whole lot about. But if you have a number of companies, say U.S. companies, that are calling the U.S. government and saying, hey, we're having troubles in China, we're having troubles in Iran or other countries, you have diplomatic relations with them, you know the right people to talk to in the governments, why don't you guys get on the phone and help us out here? Where's the responsibility around there, or is that too idealistic? Realistically, is that a role that the State Department, for example, wants to play or can play?
Well, it obviously depends on, some places are easier and some places are harder. But it's much easier, and again, this was sort of our mantra in DRL, it's much easier if you have 5 or 8 industry competitors all saying the same thing. It's very difficult, and it was surprising to me. It was actually, I would say, bordered on shocking how resistant companies were who were complaining about the same thing, to even pick up the phone and talk to each other. We tried to bring them in to say, let's have common strategies. No, they all had their own, ambitions to be there, and they're so used to being competitive that they weren't. Well, this is a place where you should put the competitive juices aside and say we actually have a common agenda.
It's in the means to be competitive. We don't like the other telcos, but in this arena we do, in this context we do collaborate. Each meeting we have anti-corruption, antitrust statement, which we need to do, of course, but that we promise each other before each meeting not to discuss any competitive issues, prices, bids for licenses or whatever that could be competitive, but because that would break the law.
Have you found it helpful through the industry dialogue or other collaboration with other telcos? Say, if you go back to the Swedish government, or the Finnish government, are they in fact more willing to lend support or to help in some situations?
Well, the 9 industry dialogue telcos each have good contacts with their respective home governments. I think, at least from my experience, is that you can't have the home government promise to, in the future, help in any case that will emerge, because it depends on all kinds of politics and stuff. So, my firm recommendation to any company would be to have, point of contact, a very open line, so that if something happens, you can establish contact very swiftly. And then based on that, if all of the 9 companies could do likewise with their own governments, of course there is more leverage to act somehow if something really bad happens.
Great. Any other questions from the floor?
You mentioned confidentiality clauses as a blocker. In oil and mining contracts, Revenue Watch Institute has done a lot of research showing that though those clauses exist, in their application, they turn out to not actually, they're not needed most of the time. Now, I know that a country's claims about national security are going to be a lot more intense, and you're going to face a lot more repercussions if you test them or violate them, but is there any work being done on that test case of, well, theoretically we could get national security punishment, but it's still worth pushing the envelope on what you disclose about these kind of practices?
I think it's one of the areas that needs a lot of attention. Again, as Rebecca said earlier, everything doesn't or shouldn't be disclosed, and there are some legitimate reasons not to disclose, both on the part of governments and for companies trying to abide by the law. But companies misuse secrecy and national security in such egregious ways and so uniformly that I think we need to really take a hard look at that and try to find some collective strategies. I mean, one of the things I know in this sector, we're having early discussions with, the Googles and Yahoos. One of the challenges initially was that you had people in country as the main interlocutors with government making decisions about a whole range of things. And so if you take that decision home, you insulate the people who are on the front line, as it were, and you may be able to have a more kind of arm's length discussion and a more thoughtful discussion about what can be disclosed and what's not. I think the premise ought to be, the presumption ought to be, in those situations where you have a repressive government that's saying this is a violation, to even tell anybody you've colluded with us, I think the presumption ought to be, how do we get around that? And again, try to find an industry position that begins to really push at that. There's got to be a constant pushback against unreasonable secrecy in the name of national security.
It's a real problem, and again, it kind of also comes back to policy advocacy. There are just so many state secrets laws and laws that make it much harder for companies to communicate basic information. And a coordinated strategy around improving that.
Yeah, or trying, as we've talked about, to come up with some standard for what that looks like, so that everyone is playing on the same field.
Yeah, and that's part of necessaryandproportionate.org. That's one effort to kind of come up with a common set of sort of legal standards for law, at least around surveillance and law enforcement. But there's, I think other efforts as well to try and get, if your government is actually committed to freedom of expression and privacy, here are some of the things you should and should not be doing. And the more we can have those kind of principles out, sort of common statements around, and again, alliance between industry and civil society on, here's what if you're a government, you claim to believe in freedom of expression and privacy, this is what you need to do if you want companies to actually be able to protect their users' rights.
So standards for states.
Yeah, standards for states, is part of it. I mean, it really goes hand in hand. If you don't have standards for states, in terms of, you need law that actually enables government, that actually enables companies to respect their users' and customers' rights, and otherwise it just becomes much more difficult.
If I can just add one other piece which we haven't talked about, which I think is also part of this space. The issues of secrecy and privacy and national security are much less important or less of a challenge when you talk about the relationship of companies to their customers. And that's also part of this discussion. So when we talk about standards, and I know there's a long-standing discussion about this, I don't think it's probably been as effective as it needs to be. But companies also are, the internet industry in particular has basically monetized information about its customers who are really a part of its business, their business plans. But there are all kinds of issues relating to privacy in particular that ought to be part of this discussion. That's part of the human rights discussion. And certainly companies, it's within their grasp to figure out what do they want to make public and how do they want to deal with those issues. I think that we have to include that in the discussion when we're talking about human rights and privacy.
Yes, indeed. Good. Well, we are right at time, so would invite any sort of further discussion with our panelists. But in the meantime, thank you all very much. Very, very interesting.